Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, we can get started. Thank you first, Dr. Alley. We are very pleased to have you here with the AGSA grad students from Kansas State University. And I'm gonna present the speaker. And I got to know personally, not personally, but from one of my classes back 2 semesters ago, Dr. Alley assertion-evidence model for doing scientific presentations, which I found amazing. So he's going to share some of his research that he has been doing on this. And Dr. Alley is a teaching professor of engineering and communication at Penn State. He holds a master on electrical engineering and in fine arts in writing. He's the author of a famous book that's called The Craft of Scientific Presentations. And later on, he wrote The Craft of Scientific Writing. So yeah, he had given this assertion evidence way of doing scientific presentations to several companies, including Google and people from Harvard and different universities across the globe. So we are very proud to have you here, and I'll give you the word, and please, if you wanted to share screen, whatever, feel free to do so. So thank you, Dr. Alley.
Okay, Nicholas. Yes. Can everybody see my screen? All right, good. You know, early in the pandemic, I gave a presentation to a group of grad students, and they were so kind. They didn't say that they couldn't see my screen, which was really sad to me. So I'm real excited to be here. I always enjoy talking about this subject, and I have never had the fortune of visiting Kansas State, so at least virtually I get to do this. Congratulations on your football team. Your football team's been playing very well. Yeah, there was a Tulane game, but other than that, you've been doing very well. And as our team has been as well, but toughest part of our schedules are coming up. Anyway, I want you to think about some work that you're going to be presenting as I go through this talk. And in this talk, what I hope to do is I hope to give you some advice to raise the level of your presentations. And so, you know, as Nicholas said, I'm going to be talking about a different approach. It's got this fancy name, assertion evidence approach, but it's a different way than most people use to present their science. And so when someone's going to say that they want to teach you something different, you should be skeptical. And I hope that you'll have a healthful skepticism during this presentation. But just a couple of things. You can find this talk, and actually even some side branches to this talk, on iBiology talks on YouTube. I know that you're recording this particular session, but you might find some other things there. And so that's easy. Just Google my last name, iBiology, and you'll get there. And so this approach that I'm going to be sharing with you is one that is gaining some steam. You may not have seen it before, but there are pockets of people who are using it, and some really good research groups. One of our largest research groups at Penn State, everyone uses it for all their presentations, to industry, to government, to conferences. And so that's really where our focus is going to be. It's going to be on research presentations. So yes. And another source that you can have besides my textbook is take a look at this free website, assertion-evidence.com. And there you can find quite a bit of things that will help you. PowerPoint templates, some model talks, some nice films that just talk about the why behind this approach. And this site, you may not be able to remember the URL, but this site is easy to get to. Just Google engineering presentations, and it'll be one of the first sites that comes up. Okay, cool. All right. Now, don't hesitate. I kind of keep an eye on the chat. I'm also going to be asking questions. And, it's if you want to, I know it may be a bandwidth issue for you, but if you want to share your screen, you're more than, and have your face rather than just a name, that's absolutely fine. At times I will kind of stop and ask for questions and things, but if there's a question that's burning, just kind of toss it into the chat. So let's start. I'd like to start with assumptions. As I said, I want you to think about a research presentation that you're going to have to give down the road, and in a sense, test the advice I give you with that presentation in mind. And so my main assumption is for that presentation, the measure of success is how well that presentation is understood by the audience, how well it's remembered, and how well it's believed. So remembered is one that maybe you haven't thought about, but in science and engineering, a lot of us, what happens is we go to a conference and we present, people hear it, they go back to their schools or their institutions and talk about the presentations that meant the most to them. And it's the ones that are remembered. It's the 3 or 4 that people remember out of the 20-some presentations they see. Those are often the ones that spread. And so that's what you want to be. You want your presentation to be one of those that's remembered. And of course, being believed is really important. I mean, you could have a presentation that, people understand it and people remember it, but they don't believe anything in it. And so one aspect about this idea about being believed goes way back into the 19th century. It goes back to Michael Faraday, who, in a sense, kind of set a precedent for us in science and engineering because he walked out behind the podium. He didn't read his scientific talks, and rather he talked to the audience without any notes. And the reason is that he felt that equally important with the content was this idea that the audience believed in him, that he had credibility, and that he had to know his work because the audience sitting there would not have the ability to run the experiment or to even do the calculations, in the time when he was speaking. So I think that's kind of interesting. Understood, remembered, and believed. Before we kind of dive into this approach, just want to step back and think big picture. So here's a question I have for you for the chat, and it is, what do you think are the most important ingredients? It could be in the talk, it could be with the speaker for a successful scientific presentation. No wrong answers here, but what would you say? So, Sakin, engaging the audience. All right, there's one kind of a thing. Passion in the work, Sarah says. All right, way to go, Sarah. Yeah, using visual elements, Carlos says. These are good. And I can talk about all of these. What do you think? What do you think? These are ingredients here. Yeah, I see probably a couple that I have this kind of list. I've gone around and asked a lot of scientists and engineers this question and kind of collected things. Peyton? Peyton?
Really? All that dust and...
Peyton Mahler, I think you may want to mute there, buddy. Yeah.
So Nicholas, you can mute him as well as a host.
Yeah, I'm not able to mute him. Well, maybe I can.
There we go. I already did.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could mute him, that would be good. So this is good. Confidence in your work, self-confidence. This is good, Eduardo and Rashab. And so that's something I do want to talk about. I'll come back to. We got a number of things. So I've got communicating the details and results clearly. It's very good. So I've got like these three things, and the first one is you need strong content, and I have Stephen Hawking here kind of representing that. So as you know, Stephen Hawking, when he was in his early 20s, developed this debilitating disease, and so he was unable to do a lot of the things that you typically see discussed in speaking books. Couldn't stand tall, couldn't project his voice, but Hawking filled auditoriums wherever he went, and he filled auditoriums because the content was so strong. So there's one. And then there's a second one that's kind of arisen again from my surveys is what Sakin talked about, and that is passion. I don't know if you're familiar with this speaker, Hans Rosling. He sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but kind of a World Health statistician. You got to go to TED if you haven't done so. Anybody seen any of his talks? Go see his first TED talk. I think that one is just amazing, the way he presents graphical data. But but the man has incredible passion for his subject. Now Rosling is exuberant. That's a word that we would use. Not all of us. That's not the way passion comes out in all of us. Another TED Talk we're seeing is the one by Jill Bolte Taylor, neuroscientist, and she's more low key, but there is absolutely no doubt that she is passionate. She cares deeply about her subject. Charles Bolden, the NASA engineer, he's still a third one, kind of has a different kind of personality. So I think passion can come out in different ways. But here's the thing. As you speak, the audience has to know that you care about the subject, even though it can come out in a lot of ways. And I'll say that many speakers don't have that passion. Okay, they don't or they don't show the passion that they had. They hide behind the podium. Their voice doesn't isn't earnest, doesn't have any inflection and things. So strong content, passion, and then what a lot of you discussed, and Jane Goodall's kind of my hero here, is this idea of a keen sense of audience, who they are, and that's always a challenge for us in science, because a lot of times we have multiple audiences, what they know about the subject and why they are in the room. What is it about your research that's going to engage them? I'd say if you've got these three ingredients, you're going to be a winner. And so a lot of the things that you said, using visual elements, that kind of comes in this idea of keen sense of the audience and what it is that they need. Engaging the audience, that comes through your passion. Sarah was the one who talked about passion. And then the confidence, that's still another thing but I'll touch on that a little bit later. So that's kind of the big picture. Now I'd kind of like to focus in on actually an aspect of presentations that when I first started researching scientific presentations, I didn't necessarily think that slides were so important. But what I've come to realize is that they contribute more to the success and probably more often downfall of scientific presentations than most people realize. Here's one way. So you kind of see what's on there. You've got somebody when they're, in this case, she's making slides for a presentation. When you're making slides for a presentation, you actually make a lot of really important decisions about that talk. What you're going to include, and equally important, what you're going to exclude. A lot of people, they try to present everything. And in presenting everything, they end up communicating very little because the audience gets overwhelmed with this tsunami of details. And you've been there. You've been there in a talk. It's just going by so fast. Maybe they put a bank of equations up really early on, and you just cannot process it all. The best speakers don't do that. Okay. Actually, a really nice thing is the best speakers don't hurry. Is kind of a nice kind of idiom, not idiom, but a kind of a principle that there's a number of teachers of scientific presentations say, and I like that one. So you make decisions about what to include and what to exclude. You also, on what you're going to include, also make really important decisions. What are you going to emphasize, and what are you just going to fold into your speech? And I would say right there, that's where a lot of presenters kind of fall down because they don't have a good filter for what to include and what to exclude. They try to include too much. And slides actually are part of that, as we'll talk about. A second thing is that slides affect the delivery of a talk. A lot of people like to put these bullet lists, and they'll bring these bullet lists one at a time in. And what happens is, it kind of reminds me of that caged lion, is that the speaker is trying to look at the audience, but then has to put in another bullet, has to turn back to the screen, kind of read or paraphrase that bullet, then back to the audience, back to the screen, back to the audience. It's like that poor lion in that cage, just pacing back and forth. The best speakers don't do that. The best speakers, as much as they can, will keep their attention on the audience. Now, they may turn and explain a graph, but when they turn to the slide, it's the audience is looking at that slide too, because the audience is they're trying to understand that graph. And then the third thing just has to do with comprehension. And so this is some work, and you can go to that assertion-evidence.com site and read about some of these studies we've done. But we've done studies where we've had two rooms. In one room, people are seeing a talk that's presented in a typical way, and then in the other room, they're seeing the exact same talk, exact same words spoken, but it's using this assertion evidence approach. And then what we've done is we've measured the comprehension of those audiences. Say we got 60 people in one room, 60 people in another. And what we found is that there are statistically significant increases in comprehension in the rooms that have, that show the assertion evidence types of slides. So those are reasons to pay attention to slides. So now I got another question for you. And my question is, what do you think? Just thinking about the presentations that you typically see, what do you find as the biggest problems with the slides that scientists typically show? You put it in the chat. Just get some ideas in the chat. Say what you see. Biggest problem in the slides that people typically show. Carlos, lots of abbreviations. There are no wrong answers here. Too much text, more text on one slide. Sakine said, Sarah, too much text or not enough. Okay. All right, those are some things. Yeah. Results section, a lot of information there. So, if you kind of look at a lot of these are talking about too much text. And so I've done some surveys, used to do them really formally, about what problems do scientists and engineers most often cite about slides. And as I said, used to do them really formally, and it wasn't close. I mean, the one, as I said, there are no wrong answers, but the one that was most often cited was just too many words, too much text on the slides. And we see, and look, it's not hard. We can find loads of examples. I've got some of these here. A couple of them are from my university. It could go any place. You could find slides that have too much text. And so it's kind of interesting is why so many people say that. And there's some psychology research that really has kind of uncovered why that's such a big problem. So let's say you got a speaker here on the left, you've got an audience. I mean, that speaker is going to be saying words, the audience is going to take those spoken words through the ears, and then may have some written words that are on, let's say, a slide. The audience will take those in through the eyes. And it was in the late 80s that the second half of the 80s, this Canadian researcher by the name of Alan Pivio, he found out that written words and spoken words are processed in the same part of the brain. And so that research kind of was out there. I want you to know that research arose after PowerPoints became, people started really paying attention to it. It was after PowerPoint's defaults were introduced. PowerPoint came out. So, but he did this work in Canada. And so then there was another researcher in Australia by the name of John Sweller. And he thought about this work, and he said, so if written words and spoken words are processed in the same part of the brain, could that part of the brain become overloaded, much as a central processing unit of a computer can become overloaded if you have it try to do too many tasks? And so he did experiments in which he had slides that didn't have so much text on them, but then he had slides that had quite a bit of text on them. And what he found out is he actually had three rooms: a room where people were just reading, a room where people were just listening, and a room where they had listening and then presentation slides. And when there weren't many words on the slides, that third room had the highest comprehension. But he found that there was this point, and this slide is well beyond that point, is that when there's too much text, that room where you had the highest comprehension all of a sudden came down and had the lowest comprehension. And so what Sweller called that line, and it's a little different for all of us, but he called that kind of line where this flip happened, he called that cognitive overload. And so what happens is the readers and listeners trying to do too much. And that's something that we want to avoid. And even if you don't buy into what I suggest in this presentation, that's something that you do want to pay attention to. If you have too much text that you're showing, and your speech is going to be the same, okay? The pace of your speech is going to remain the same. So you're not really going to be changing that. But if you show too much text, audiences will be able to keep up, and their comprehension is going to go way down. And to me, it's really kind of interesting in such a situation, assuming you don't have any images on that particular slide, then that presentation actually would be better if you didn't show any slides at all. If you just had a black screen, okay, then what you're seeing there. So too many words, that was the most common thing. A couple of others that were, ranked high. As I said, there are no wrong answers, but a real common one, and people said it differently, is clutter. And so much clutter that the audience isn't sure where to look. So it may not necessarily just be words, but it could be words and images. And this slide, I think, demonstrates that clutter. And a problem here is that the audience may be looking at one part of the slide, and the speaker may be talking at another part of the slide. And then the third one, and again, this slide is a good example, and you take a look at that graph, you probably figured it out. There's as much text as not readable. So there are a lot of things we can improve on slides, but I would say these three right here are the big three. And you could just make a lot, when you do a presentation, just these three things. If you focus on these three, you will improve your slides quite a bit. Cool. So, if you think about these three sources, PowerPoint's defaults are actually a reason for these problems. And these defaults have been around since, mid 1980s. And I'd say the big thing, a big takeaway is that you can do better. So just kind of going back here to this default, it's this one right here, in the body where you've got these bulleted lists and second level, third level, fourth level, fifth level, and some people, God help us, use all those levels, is that leads people to have too many words. And it's also that bulleted list ends up taking a lot of space, ends up kind of crowding what images we have. And then when the images get crowded, they get smaller, then we end up with axes that are too small. I'd say the big thing is we can do better. There is no research behind PowerPoint's defaults. If you kind of read the history of it, it was this entrepreneur, Robert Gaskins, and then this computer scientist, Dennis Austin. They were trying to come up with a program that could scale the lettering of text. This was back at a time when it was real difficult to incorporate images into computer programs. And so they were just trying to do the size thing, and they did a great job with that, but they didn't really know this research of PyBO and Sweller. And that was well, it hadn't come out yet, but I think that was unfortunate. And the defaults have not changed that much. And you think, well, why not? And a big reason is Microsoft has 95% of the market share. And to change those defaults, they would have to overhaul the program. There are all these layers of code, that have been accumulated with each version of PowerPoint over the years. You'd have to go down to the bottom layer, and that would just mean a lot of work. And again, go back to my first point, Microsoft has 95% of the market share. They don't have a lot of reason to do that work. So we've talked about problems. At this point, ask if you've got any questions. Any questions? How are we doing so far? You learning anything? Anything? Is this still interesting to you? Okay, I got a thumbs up from Carlos. Thank you. Yeah, okay, very nice. All right. Okay, well, we're going to keep going. So the next question, so this is where it gets to be a little, then a little dicier, is what do we do? What do we do? And so I'm going to give you three principles, and it's principles of this, what I call this assertion-evidence approach. The assertion-evidence approach has its roots back in the national laboratories in the 1980s. That actually national laboratories, Lawrence Livermore was the first one that kind of adopted it, this assertion. That it wasn't called that at the time. I coined that phrase later on because I resurrected it. But a number of the labs were starting to use it. Dow Corning started to use it. So it was something that was starting to catch on. But then PowerPoint came out, and kind of like a bad virus, the defaults of PowerPoint spread around the world, and so it just kind of overshadowed other ways that people were creating presentation slides. So I'm going to show you these three principles. Interestingly, these three principles that I'm going to show you are, and it was kind of done independently, are the same principles that you would follow if you were doing a TED Talk, okay? And so here's the first principle. First principle is the toughest, and it is build your talk on messages, not on topics. Most people build their research talks on topics: introduction, literature review, background, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. Look, I know what I can predict what a lot of people's headlines are going to be, and it's going to be the largest type on the slide. It's going to take up quite a bit of space, and True, it orients us to what part of the talk is in, but in terms of most valuable information from that talk, doesn't contain it. And so if you were to give a TED talk, what they would ask you to do is they would bring you into a room and they probably give you a big pad of Post-it notes. And they would tell you, I want you to use these Post-it notes to write down what you see are the most important messages of your talk, what you want the audience to walk out the room with. And they will tell you a message is a sentence. It's not a phrase. And so, and you put one message on a Post-it. And so you kind of write these Post-its, one message on a Post-it, and then you kind of take those, then they kind of put them on a wall and they arrange them in the way they think would be most effective. And then that becomes, you could think, the storyline of the presentation. So I'm asking you to kind of do sort of the same thing. Think about what your most important takeaway messages are. And then in this approach, you're going to put those up at the top. And a couple of guidelines: keep that headline to 1 or 2 lines. If it goes more than 2 lines, people won't read it. It's too much text to read. So a lot of times you have to tighten it, and that takes some effort. I'd say another thing is that headline becomes a filter that for the rest of the slide. And in a way, even though you're spending more words up there, you end up with fewer words in the body of your slide, because if the body of the slide doesn't support the message at the top, you don't put it on there. And that is, I'd say, a really powerful thing. Another thing about the message up at the top is that for the audience, if they become lost, if they zone out, or they just kind of look at their, they get a text message they have to look at, they come back to the talk, that sentence is a safety rope for them. It allows them to stay in the presentation. Whereas a lot of people, they bury the message. It's in the middle of some bullet list, or sometimes it's not even on the slide anywhere. But this way, you've got it on the slide. That's principle number 1. So at this point, I'd like you think about that talk that you're thinking about. What is one message you want the audience to walk out the room with in that talk? So kind of let you put that into the chat. Just one message you want the audience to walk out with. And just as if it were a TED Talk, message is a sentence. It's not a phrase. Are y'all writing? Should be writing a message here. I'm hoping we can get at least one. Now, sometimes maybe I'm not able to see the chats. How about someone just unmuting and saying their message?
All right, I can say mine. And so for myself would be, I want the audience to have a clear answer to the question why the topic I'm researching is relevant for the community, for the agronomy community in this case.
So what's the what's the sentence?
And I mean, that sentence would be like, why it's basically an answer why phenotypic plasticity it's relevant for studying response to nitrogen. That's, I don't know if I'm getting correctly.
Yeah, I know. So you're getting to the topic, but you haven't set the question. So yeah, so somebody said that they missed the question. Yeah, write one message.
So I would say, Michael, like my research is on cover crop for weed suppression, and I want like the audience will take a message like that how cover crop is important for the weed suppression.
Yeah, okay, but you still haven't said a sentence yet. Okay. I mean, she does. Look at her on the screen. Installing a coal panel greatly reduces the number of active ghost pots. That's a sentence. That is a step up the mountain of her research. That is something that somebody could challenge. Okay, I'm going to let you think about that one, but I'll tell you there's that it's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, this is and I'd say probably the biggest challenge of using this approach is that you have to do more work before the presentation. I think it's valuable work, but you have to do more work before the presentation because you've really got to think about what is it that you want in every scene you want the audience to take away. Your message could have been from a result you wanted them to take away. It could have been, getting to this idea of importance. So cooling gas turbine blades in a jet engine is important because the temperatures of the gases that flow over those blades are hundreds of degrees hotter than the blade's melting temperature. Okay, so you see there's one, but here's one. Cover crops play a major role in weed suppression. Okay, thank you, Sakine. That is a sentence. Yeah. Okay, cover crops have the potential to combat sediment loss from intensifying rain events. All right, so that is a step up the mountain. Somebody could challenge it, so you'd have to back that up. And it's that kind of statement that, thank you, Sarah. That's what I call it. An assertion, okay? I'm not the only one who calls it that. Everybody would call it that, but that's an assertion, but it's a takeaway message. So other people would have just written importance. And then they would, the audience would have to kind of figure out what is the importance. But here, you're kind of leading with that assertion. That's building your talk on messages, not on topics. So that's principle number one. Principle number two is support your messages with visual evidence, not bullet lists. Bullet lists really are your notes, but visual evidence, that could be photographs, that could be drawings, that could be diagrams, that could be graphs, that could be, a film, short film. Yeah. So that I'd say is principle number two. And a reason for it is that also we kind of found out from psychology research, and actually this is Richard Mayer, who is at UC Santa Barbara, is that people learn much more deeply from words and relevant images than from words alone. And so that Pivio guy I was telling you about earlier, not only did he find that written words and spoken words are processed in the same part of the brain, but he also found that images are processed in a different part of the brain. And so this Mayer person, there are a number of people, but he's probably kind of the lead. He kind of said, well, what's then the effect of incorporating images when you're trying to teach or present work, your work to people? And what he found is, and this is his big takeaway, I mean, years of research, lots of studies, people learn much more deeply from words and relevant images than from words alone. And so I'll tell you, when I have a slide, generally it's going to have some kind of image on it. Sometimes I have just maybe a transition. You'll see one here in a second, but generally it's going to have an image on it. So let's look at some examples. And I'd like to start first with the method section. And I'm going to take a PhD student here from Penn State. His name's Jimmy Sweller. So this is from his, the slide I'm going to show you, it's going to be from the method section of his PhD dissertation. Okay. So what Jimmy's working on is kind of leading up to this slide. Jimmy's working on trying to get a sense of how much pollution is occurring in streams that are in state parks in the northeast part of the country. Okay. And so he kind of he's looking at 53 streams, that's his set, and he's trying to determine how much pollution is occurring in those 53 streams in these state parks. And he's got, you have to have some kind of reference for this kind of work. He's got 12 streams that are really isolated from man, and those are his kind of reference streams. And so at this point, he's going to define what he means by pollution. So that's this scene. And his takeaway is for the 53 streams, we assess the conditions, the amount of pollution, using a set of 6 criteria: the acidity, the level of chloride, level of sulfate, total phosphorus, total nitrogen, and this thing called average habitat score. So if you took a liter of water, what would be the percentage that, or the likelihood that there would be tadpoles or fish or something in that? And ideally, and it's not going to be just a single point, it's going to be more of a band for all the 53 streams, that the 53 streams, they would fall in the same band as the reference streams. That's what we would hope. Okay, that when you measured all 6 of these criteria, that they would kind of fall in the same band as the reference streams. And it was interesting. So he's in his methods part of the talk, but at this point, he had an opportunity to preview a couple of results. He was going to give them in more detail later on, but he went ahead and previewed them. And what he said is one thing that we found is that while for 4 of the criteria that was true, for sulfate, the level of sulfate was distinctly beyond the reference. It wasn't so much that we knew that the stream was being impaired, that wildlife were negatively affected, but it was certainly beyond the reference band. And the chloride level was not only beyond the reference band, but actually on average for those 53 streams was at a level that did start to impair the stream, that affected the plants and the wildlife. I love this slide. I saw Jimmy give this slide once, and I don't do it as well as Jimmy does, but I'm able to tell the story. And I think that's really powerful. Everything on this slide counts. There's no like extra noise and stuff. I thought that was cool. I thought another thing that's cool is he kind of tells this scene as a vignette. Most people just would have had just a bullet list on here, and they would have had the 6 things. Maybe they would have had a table. Maybe. I doubt it. But, they just had that bullet list. But here, he's got this, he's kind of has this story that he tells. I just think that's really cool. I just think this is a great slide. Okay. All right. Sakine also likes this slide. Let's look at another one. So we're going to go to a results slide, okay? And this results slide, oh, by the way, I'll tell you one thing here about Jimmy, is he gave his PhD presentation. He was in a workshop of mine, really similar to what you're in. Just kind of heard this and he ran with it. I mean, because I think he's got a lot of really good imagination, very visual thinker, but he ran with it, did his whole PhD dissertation in this style. The committee member said to him, standing next to another committee member, said, that was the best PhD presentation I've ever seen. And the other guy said, I don't know about that. I think this is just one of the best presentations we've ever seen in our department, period. And he went ahead, he gave a portion of this work at a conference. He won best presentation at that conference, which I think is pretty cool for a new PhD student. So we'll take a look at another one. This one's Jacob Snyder. Jacob this was also from his PhD presentation, also one that he presented at an engineering conference. You don't have to know a whole lot about the background, except that he's doing 3D printing, additive manufacturing, and he's printing these really small cylinders that are used to for heat transfer. So in that gas turbine engine, that jet engine I told you about, those gases are really hot, and they come over these turbine blades. Don't have to worry too much about them if they're in a part of the thing. And the game is try to keep those from melting. So you try to take away as much heat as possible. So here he's talking about with additive manufacturing. One thing you can pay attention to is how you build whatever it is you're building. So here he's building a cylinder. And so one way you can build that cylinder is vertically. And so you kind of think of a smokestack kind of going up. And so you've got this powder, and then a laser shines on the powder, and when the laser moves, the powder cools, and it kind of forms this cylinder. So you got to imagine this kind of smokestack, and you look at it and you see, one thing you see is it's really, really small. The radius is 0.25 millimeters. Okay, so like we're talking, your hair. Really, really small. So, but you see some of it's red, it's kind of reddish, some of it's kind of yellow, some of it's green. So the true diameter was 0.25 millimeters. So where it's red, it's a little bit bigger. Maybe it's getting up to almost 0.3 millimeters. Where it's kind of greenish, it's maybe getting small to 0.2 millimeters. But you can kind of see it's got some bumps and things, but it's pretty, it's kind of the shape that you had imagined. Well, what would happen if you built it like a pipeline? Instead of building it vertically, you built it horizontally. And so here, you're kind of build it kind of at the bottom part and then kind of come up. What would it look like then? And what he found is it looked like that. And you think, oh my gosh, that's not even close to what it is that you wanted. And that's true. And you can kind of see, the top is really, really kind of caved in. And it makes sense because that powder doesn't have any support for it as you kind of go around that, around that cylinder. But here's the thing about the use is that having roughness in this pipe or this cylinder is actually a good thing because that increases the heat transfer. And what you can do with additive manufacturing, what you can't do with regular, machining, is that you can tilt it. So you could go 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and you could control how much roughness you have. And now all of a sudden, people who make jet engines, they are really excited because now they have a way that they could maybe improve that heat transfer that they've never had before, that they've never had with traditional. Let me ask you, what did you like about this scene? What did you think was effective in this scene? You could unmute or you could drop it in the chat. How many of you like this slide? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Sakeen. Anybody has any thoughts here? Well, I like that it's a story again. And stories, I've always kind of heard, yeah, you should try to tell stories, but it kind of struck me as false. It's hard to kind of think of your talk as just a single story. I mean, it kind of is, but it's kind of hard to think about that. But I can see each scene kind of, I like this word vignette. It's kind of a really short story, but he kind of tells that story. If he'd shown all 3 of these images at the beginning, my mind would have, my eyes would have kind of gone to the ones on the right. But having the just the one there and let us kind of understand, okay, that's what in this case what he's doing, that helps us to then be able to process these next 2. I thought that one's pretty cool. That one's pretty cool. So I kind of showed you a couple of examples. I'm going to do a trick here, but I'm going to tell you what the trick is. And the trick is I am going to jump to a later spot in the presentation. Now, a lot of people, when they do that, they just hit the arrow and then they go through a bunch of slides and then everybody's sad because maybe they're sad, but they say, well, we didn't get a chance to really see those slides. But you can jump to a slide in a presentation, in a PowerPoint presentation. You can jump to it without the people knowing. Does anybody know how to do that? Does anybody know what you type in? You have to type in at the, to the keyboard. No, but that would be helpful. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so you type in the slide number you want to go to. All right. So I'm going to type in my slide number. I'm going to hit enter, and then all of a sudden I jumped. So that is kind of a nice thing. And a lot of times when I am giving a presentation, I have a Post-it note that's by the keyboard, and it's got some key slides that let me jump to a slide that I want to go to. But that's one that you can do. You want to make sure you have your conclusion slide. That one's really good. But then if someone says, would you go back to slide 6, you can hit 6, enter, and then you're already there. Okay, so principle number 3, again, same thing as it was TED Talk. Explain the visuals by fashioning sentences on the spot. In other words, don't try to memorize your talk. You want to practice. Definitely you want to practice. And there will be some transition phrases that you fall in love with that you say every time, but you give the talk a little differently. I mean, the assertions keep you on track, but what's nice is, and a lot of people say that it's kind of empowering to them, is that they're not chained anymore, or they're not caged anymore by the bulleted list, that they'll think about the audience and maybe they might explain a graph a little bit differently each time, but they've got that freedom. And a couple of presentations I'd like you to, just take a look at are, one is this presentation. It's a TED Talk by Cheryl Hayashi. And you can see that you can see that this is an assertion evidence slide. She used assertion evidence all throughout her talk. Sometimes the camera doesn't show it, but it's okay. I mean, she has used it all throughout her talk, but watch her. And the reason I love this TED Talk, it's probably one of the most technical TED Talks that I've seen. Certainly, yeah, the beginning of it, this particular scene's not particularly technical, but later on, she gets into some technical things. And I think it's the assertion evidence helps her do it. And when you get to about 7 minutes in, she presents 2 graphs. Think that it's just a tour de force on how she presents those graphs. So that would be nice. Another talk I think is, Google TED Spiders. That'll get you there. And then another talk I think is really cool is this 3-minute thesis. I don't know if you're familiar with that competition, but a 3-minute thesis by this Samuel Ramsey. He's graduated now, but when he was a doctoral candidate in, I think, his entomology at University of Maryland. Just 3 minutes. What I like about this talk, so 3-minute thesis competition, you're allowed only 1 slide. But what I like is I really like just how thoughtful he was about the words that he used. I think it's just a great example of what words to use. And so what I'm going to do is going to kind of close out and then take questions, and I'll answer questions as long as you can. So just Dr. Sammy, 3 minutes, that'll get you there. But to finish up, what I would say is that using this assertion evidence approach is what we found, what a lot of graduate students and researchers have found is that they say their talks are better understood by our audiences. And then they end up projecting more confidence during the talk. And the reason is that they're not always looking back at these bulleted lists. There aren't any bulleted lists. I mean, but they are explaining visual evidence that they know. And in a sense, that projects the confidence. I've got, if you go to this site, I've got a couple of short films about confidence. You look under home, you'll see those films. There's just one is internal confidence, and that one's tough. That's what you feel inside. The other one is projected confidence, and that one you can really do a lot of things with, but there's some nice suggestions there. But anyway, I appreciate you listening, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. It was amazing. If anyone has any questions, just drop them on the chat. I can read them, or just feel free to unmute yourself. I'll start with mine. I've realized that during this presentation and even the slides that you were sharing, that people we're using a lot of this corporal language. What's your opinion about that? Like moving hands when presenting, and do you think it's something that we should do or it should be avoided?
Yeah, I think I think it's crazy, this idea of standing still. There are times when that's appropriate. I wouldn't be so caught up in some of these delivery rules, but I think it's a misconception that you don't move your hands. Here's what I would suggest to you. I think the best way to improve your delivery is to think about who you've seen has the best delivery. And then, and this is kind of like acting a little bit, when you present, try to, in a sense, be that person. Try to present the way that person does. So if the person does move their hands, like you look at that Jill Bolte Taylor, she has these, she has some really dramatic hand movements, but at times then she's very still. I mean, it's kind of she uses, I'd say she uses movement for purpose. It has a reason. It helps the audience imagine what it is that she's saying. So I would say, and I do that. You can do that with cadence. You can do that with just the way they answer questions. But I think that's a real nice way to, I mean, you'll kind of adopt them for a while, and then your variation on their theme will come about. It's a good question. Good question, Nicholas. Anybody else has a question?
Yes, I have a question. Well, sorry for the noise. I'm still in the lab, but most of the student competitions, they have a evaluation form, which is, well, most of them, at least the one I've seen, they are based on introduction, material methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. So, and some of the evaluators, they don't really, maybe they would understand very well using a different approach, which doesn't include clearly the name, introduction, material method, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
What will be your recommendation? How you kind of tailor a little bit of a presentation using a different approach, the assertion evidence approach, and still have a chance of winning one of those competitions, for example?
Yeah. So Carlos, you ask a good question. I do think, just kind of preface it, I do think the most important presentations we give are not necessarily for competitions. They are to present our dissertation, to present our work at a conference, to, if we're trying to get it, let's say, an academic job at another university, that kind of talk that we give there. Those are probably our most important presentations. But let's say that I am in a competition and I want to compete, but I still want to use the assertion evidence. So one thing I would probably do is my title slide, I would have something probably look like this one. Okay, I'd have something that looks something like that. Okay, but nobody has introduction on their title slide. But then when I had my next slide, maybe my next slide, I can do a lot on this particular slide in talking about maybe the importance of the work. This particular work, what she talked about is she talked about that many of you are familiar with wind turbines that are on a tower. But there's another kind of way that you could have a wind turbine, and that is a wind turbine that's suspended on a balloon. And an advantage of that second way is you can get much higher than a tower, rather than 600 feet to 900 feet. You could get up to 2,000 feet easily with this one. And then another advantage is the winds are stronger there, and they're more consistent. But so those are like some things that I could say on this particular slide. But if I had another slide that was part of the introduction, I could still have my sentence, but what I could do is maybe in a different color type, I could write introduction, maybe in blue, put a colon, and then put my assertion. Same when I get to methods. I have methods, maybe in blue type, and then in black type, I have my takeaway. And the takeaway might be, for methods, might be something, let me go here. Yeah, I don't know if this one will work. This one might not work here, but I'm gonna go 33. Yeah, I might try to put methods, see if I can fit that in front of extremum. I might have to cut a couple words and then put a colon and then put that there. And so then I could, in a sense, have that, but I still have the sentence. Okay, and that's really the takeaway. Sounds good?
Thank you.
Cool.
Yes, yes.
Got another question. Well, by the way, I love this slide. I didn't get the chance to go through it, but I loved it that she uses this shading. So what she has is she's got a box here. It's a it's a square or a rectangle that covers this part of the graph. I mean, a part of the this is a diagram. And then when she clicks, that rectangle, which has some transparency to it, disappears. At the same time, this thing comes into the graph. But she's able, in a sense, to kind of walk the audience through this diagram, okay, and couple it with the graph. It's really pretty cool. Really pretty cool. You can see her do that. Michelle Case is who does that. That's on Assertion-Evidence.com. Look at the graduate student research talks for model talks. Cool. Is it better to start the presentation with layman's language and then dive into technicalities? Rishab asks, yes. You want to start with the familiar and then go to what is new. So we go back to Michelle's first talk, first slide. No, going back here. Forget it. Go to the slide. Yeah. So this is Michelle's first slide on that. And what she did is she started with, I think many of you are familiar with wind turbines that are on a tower. So she started with what's familiar. I also liked it. She worked in the word you. I think the word you ought to come in your first couple of sentences, okay? You're giving the talk to somebody and you're recognizing that they are there. It's just good habit. But start with the familiar, move to the new. And so when you start to the familiar, then you generally start with language that they're familiar with. So it's broader language, and then you focus. Cool.
I have another question, Michael. It just came up to mind. You mentioned something about like practicing our presentations and rehearsing.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your advice there? Is there any specific things maybe regarding the presentation that we should keep in mind and practice beforehand?
Yeah.
Or over, because someone once gave me an advice. I'm not sure. I never tested it because I usually don't practice too much. I feel uncomfortable day and later presenting, but over practicing the presentation might be might be pushing you down. I don't know.
I wouldn't worry about over practicing. So I ran into Jane Goodall once at the Philadelphia airport. I told her, I present to a lot of young scientists around the world, and they, and then I said, what piece of advice would you give them? And she said, well, it certainly wouldn't be the same piece of advice that somebody gave me before my first presentation. And she's kind of a small woman, but she's got a very powerful voice. And I could tell I had really kind of struck a nerve with her. She said, someone told me, just go up there, you're the expert. That was horrible advice. And so she talked about how she was traveling around the country. She's going to about 10 schools in the United States. And she said, I'm giving the same talk. It's a 45-minute talk. And it's a talk that I've developed over the years. So I know that she's put a lot of work into it. But she said, every single place that I go to, I insist on 45 minutes to be by myself to walk through that talk. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, you think about how much she has given this talk, how much she's practiced this talk, and she still wants to practice one more time before the talk. I think I think that says quite a bit. And she is not. No one's ever said, oh, it's over, you know, she's practiced too much. You know, I mean, it's just like she knocks it out of the park every time she presents. I would say another thing is when you practice, try to think about how to set up the next slide while you're still on the one you're on. That to me is really kind of separates excellent from good, is to be able to know what comes next. So in fact, actually, when I'm at a conference and somebody's up there presenting before me, I'm not really good at listening to that person. I kind of have a sheet of paper and I'm drawing little sketches, and the sketches are kind of thumbnails of the slides and the order of the slides. I'm kind of testing myself on, do I know what comes next? And then I try to say something. It's usually a question that then sets up that next slide. I see some people, they put questions at the top of their slides, and I think, see, I would say that question before I went to that scene. And then at the top of my scene, then I'm going to say what the takeaway is. I will say sometimes for results, particularly when the result is complicated, I might delay the headline, showing it. I might delay it and just show the graph, explain the graph a little bit, and then come in with the takeaway. But that takeaway will still be up for 30 seconds or so, you know, so that the audience gets some soak time with it. Very good. These are all good questions. Awesome.
Yeah. So I have a very quick question, Michael.
Okay.
So when we move from one slide to another slide, you know, like for the transition, what should be the like best way to transition from one slide to another? Sometimes we say, okay, moving on the next slide, or sometimes say, okay, moving on the material method. So what do you think, like, what is the best way to transition to the next slide?
I think if you can ask a question, or you can just make, instead of talking about moving on to the next slide, think about the content that you have. So let me see if I can get a sequence here. Okay, I'll show you a sequence. So this one comes, this is from, let me go see here, go back a little bit. Oh yeah, this is great. I wanted to show the sequence anyway. So you know, I'm doing this game where I'm kind of looking on one screen and I see all the thumbnails. And then, so this is a sequence that Sean Soroka had put together. And so before he went to this scene, he said, I'd like to talk about our facility. So each of you, you're in a laboratory. So he's in this laboratory. His laboratory's got an acronym. It's not that important. It's called START, but you'll see it. It has to do with these turbines, Steady Thermal Aero Research Turbine. That's the name of the laboratory. But he said, so a lot of you recognize that there are a lot of these gas turbine facilities in the world that are trying to understand this heat transfer within turbines. And so what you're looking at is that you're looking at the most important ones in the world. You can see, you know, we've got quite a few. So there certainly are one here at Penn State, our START, but there's a low speed one at Penn State. Ohio State's got one. Purdue's got one. Notre Dame's got one. There's some in Europe. But one thing that distinguishes some from the others is that some of these are steady state, while others are what's called a blowdown, where you've got just a whole bunch of air and you blow it through, and they don't last very long. I mean, some is just, you know, just milliseconds of data that you get. And when you look at the ones that are steady state, you would take away the transient ones, you see they're not nearly as many. So that's one thing that distinguishes them. A second thing that distinguishes them is the size of the components. Some of these are the actual size of a jet engine. And so when you put something in like a blade, it's the same size as in that jet engine. And when you look at then which ones are both steady state and can do the actual size, now you see we're only down to a handful, okay? So what distinguishes this Penn State start from these others, Purdue, NASA, Aachen, and things? Well, they're a lot of times what people think is how close you operate to an actual jet engine, an actual engine operating conditions. Now, we can't operate exactly at that temperature because then we couldn't measure anything because the temperatures are so high. But so we work at reduced temperatures, but we try to match these Reynolds numbers. And if you look at, you know, what these other facilities do, they do a really good job, but they're still quite distant from the actual operating engine, which is represented by this little engine here. And if you look at START, what you see is of all the facilities, START is the closest to that actual operating condition. And for that reason, I'm really confident to say that of all the public turbine rigs, START most accurately represents the engine conditions. So Sakeen, to answer your question, I never said moving on to the next slide. I didn't say any of that. It was all couched in the content. You know, it was all couched in the content. And also, I gave you a really good example, Sean, you know, because Sean knows that he has to be real careful about how he talks about the competition, because at a conference, competition's in the room. So, I mean, he delayed that headline until he knew that he had shown it with his graph, because it was controversial.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you, Michael.
No, you're welcome. Well, all these are really good questions, really good questions.
So I have another question. Sorry,
Okay.
I have many.
Okay.
And I realized when you were presenting also that you make emphasis on some words also, like putting a stronger emphasis on certain words. So what's the advice there? So it's having a post-it notes of in which slide it's the most important word for each slide, or I mean, any advice on that?
So yeah, I'd say practice, and practice in front of audiences. You know, a lot of times I emphasize words or emphasize details because I've given the talk before and I realized during the questions that people didn't pick up on that point. And so the next, and maybe it kind of works in my subconscious, but I realize, hey, I've got to emphasize that. I've got to emphasize that point. I've got to slow it down and things. So I'd say that's good. I'd say another thing is, Nicholas, and I think this is just a good habit, not just for presentations, but for a lot of things. And I think it's probably one of the 7 habits of highly successful people. And what I try to adopt is that after I give a presentation, I like to think about what worked and what could have been better. So maybe not right after, but a lot of times on a plane flying back or something, I just think about what could have been better, and maybe I make some notes on that. And so sometimes I realize, oh, I've got to do a better job of emphasizing this point or that point. But this talk that you've seen, oh my gosh, how many times have I given it? I mean, hundreds. And I mean, it's evolved over the years, and I tweak it each time so it's a little fresh. I will say you want to be careful about, you can fall in love with changing slides, you want to reach a point where you stop with the slides, because you're never going to get perfection, but you're just practicing and going within what it is that you have. Yeah, sure, if you see an error, you're going to fix it, but you're really not trying to improve it. You're just, you say these are the visual aids I'm going with.
All right, well, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, this was really good. You asked great questions. I appreciate so many people sticking around and things. Go to the website. There's a lot of good things that are there. And again, look at the graduate student talks. I think you'll see some good ones. Take a look at Dr. Sammy's talk. Take a look at Cheryl Hayashi's talk. I think you'll find some really good things there. And I just wish you best, the best, be an experimentalist, give this approach a chance. You might want to do it within a group meeting rather than at a conference, just because your advisor, if your advisor is unfamiliar with this approach, your advisor, it might be too much, for too new. People are conservative when stakes are high, but in a group, in a group meeting, yeah, tell them you want to experiment with this new approach. Some people have found success with it. Just, you can ask your advisor, are you open to trying new things? Your advisor will say, of course.
All right. Well, Mike, I think we don't have any more questions in the chat, but on behalf of all agronomy grad students from K-State, I want to say thank you very much. This was very, very useful, and I'm sure there will be plenty of people that will be watching this webinar later in YouTube, and we have a YouTube channel, and we use it as to share the resources, that we gently create for future students and actual students here in our department. So thanks a lot for your time, and yeah, hopefully we will keep in touch and we keep on improving our presentations, scientific presentations.
Yeah, well, let me know, through email, if you give this a try, what happens. If it's real successful, I'd love to read those notes. But if you get a lot of pushback, I want to read those notes too. They're a little harder to read, but that's important.
Yeah, I noticed that there are some people here that are enrolled in seminars, so hopefully we got some engagement and we got to practice it there on the seminar. So
okay, cool.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll let you know.
Yeah. Use one of those templates. Start with those. If you just open PowerPoint, it's too hard. It's really hard. But we've got templates that are there, and you can. I mean, they're free. Just download them. It's just a PowerPoint file, and just write your presentation over the template.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks much.
Okay. Cool. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.